Good day, everyone. I hope you're doing well. My name is Chiffon Wong, and I am the third Vice President of the Mystic Valley Area Branch of the NAACP and the chair of our Reparations Committee. Welcome to our chapter conversation with Congresswoman Katherine Clark on a political history of America's Black reparations movement. We established the Reparations Committee in September 2020 with a focus on reparations education, advocacy, and legislation at the federal level. This year, we provided every member of our 117th US Congress with a copy of the book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. We then called more than 400 members of Congress, including every member of the House Committee on the Judiciary during the lead up to the historic markup of HR 40. We also have submitted a reparations resolution proposal to National NAACP for possible adoption. We are very thankful to you, Congresswoman Katherine Clark, for accepting our invitation today. Congresswoman Katherine Clark proudly serves the 5th District of Massachusetts. She was first elected in a special election in December of 2013. Katherine's career in public service is driven by her commitment to helping children and families succeed. She is a vocal advocate for ending wage discrimination, protecting women's health, access to affordable, high-quality healthcare, paid family leave, safer schools, and other reforms to address the challenges women and families face. She believes that Congress must work to end the glaring disconnect between the needs of families at home and priorities in Washington. In Congress, she brings her expertise as a state senator, state representative, general counsel for the Massachusetts Office of Child Care Services, and policy chief for the state attorney general. Katherine represents a diverse district comprised of 24 cities and towns that stretch from the coastal communities of Revere and Winthrop through the economic engine of Metro West. In fall 2020, she was elected by her colleagues to serve as Assistant Speaker of the 117th Congress after serving as the Vice Chair of the House Democratic Caucus during the previous session. Additionally, she serves as a member of the Steering and Policy Committee within the caucus. Katherine is a member of the U.S. House Committee on Appropriations and 3 subcommittees within Appropriations: Labor, Health and Human Services, Education and related agencies, Legislative Branch and Transportation, and Housing and Urban Development and related agencies. Katherine is a proud member of several caucuses in Congress, including the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the Women's Caucus. Katherine, her husband Rodney, and their 3 children, Addison, Riley, and Nathaniel, live in Melrose. Today's chapter conversation will be moderated by Jennifer Yanko. Jennifer is a member of our branch's Executive Committee and Reparations Committee. If you have a question during today's conversation, please enter it into the chat where I'll be able to see it for consideration during our question and answer period. Jennifer, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chiffon, and welcome everyone. It's a real honor to be here with you, Representative Clark, to discuss this critical issue that we are all hearing more about and thinking more about. I think we should begin by defining what we mean by the term reparations. There are a lot of misconceptions about it. I think the first thing to bear in mind is that reparations derives from the verb repair. So reparations is about repairing damage. And this may seem like a simple proposition, but anyone who's had to make repairs on their car or their home knows that it is in fact rather complex. And I don't mean to minimize the gravity of this by comparing it to a house or a car, but I think that the analogy can help us think about it. We have to carefully examine what's broken to figure out how it came to be broken and the underlying causes, the scope of the damage. And this entails doing research, consulting those best placed to assess the damage, and being ready to listen and hear what they have to say. The process of repairing itself takes time. It takes persistent effort and willingness to rethink things as you come up against new information. It usually turns out to be much more complicated than you thought and much, much more expensive. The repair is complete only when the underlying causes have been addressed and remediated. How much more complex this is when we're talking about repairing human relationships. When it comes to the question of reparations, due Black Americans, we're talking about repairing the effects of centuries of exclusion, control, and pauperization of African Americans by the US government, states, and municipalities, by institutions and corporations, by social and cultural practices. We're talking about restoring people to where they would have been had it not been for these forces, and in eradicating the structures that maintain these marks of racial inequality. Grounded in slavery and continued in Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, and virtually all aspects of our society today, this exclusion, control, and pauperization is backed by violence. Violence that has continued to perpetuate and exacerbate racial subordination, exclusion, and inequality. So what are the objectives of a reparations program? One of the principal objectives is closing the racial wealth gap. And as we saw from the, I think it was 2015 Fed report, the disparity in wealth between whites and Blacks in the Boston area is rather jarring. For the average Black family, the wealth was $8. For the average white, 245,000, I believe. So there's a huge wealth gap. And so closing that racial wealth gap is one of the objectives, and eliminating racial disparities in all areas of life, including, but certainly not limited to, the criminal justice system, environmental and climate justice, education, civic engagement, democracy, and voting rights. Can you, next slide? So From Here to Equality, the book that we're discussing by William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, 3 essential elements of any reparations program are outlined. These are acknowledgement of the harm. So that would be fully owning up to it, a formal apology to all those harmed, committing to redress, and to setting the record straight. Redress or restitution involves the payment of reparations. It involves various collective programs. There are things that can only be done collectively, like improving schools, improving neighborhoods, moving toxic waste sites. There's so many ways in which reparations need to be implemented. And then the final third element is closure. And closure would mean satisfaction on the part of the harmed parties, acceptance of the efficacy of the repair, mutual reconciliation, and forgiveness. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before we begin, we're going to make a brief summary of the first chapter, A Political History of America's Black Reparations Movement. But before we begin the summary, I want to note that one of the first cases of an African successfully claiming reparations in the United States took place in 1783, right here in Medford, Massachusetts. Belinda Royal, who had been enslaved by Isaac Royal, successfully sued the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for her pension. Next slide, please. So what we have here is just a very skeletal sort of outline, a timeline of the reparations movement. And we begin with General Sherman's Field Order Number 15, issued in 1865, which allocated some 400,000 acres of land to freedmen and their families. Known as 40 acres and a mule, this measure was informed by copious data that was gathered by interviews with freedmen. What they wanted came across loud and clear: land. This, unfortunately, as we all know, was rescinded by President Andrew Johnson shortly thereafter. In 1890 and following 1890, we have a really interesting character, Callie House. Born into slavery in 1861, she went on to establish the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, which for short is MRBP, which had as its mission petitioning the government for pensions for former slaves, lobbying Congress for pensions, starting local chapters, and providing support for the formerly enslaved, as well as burial assistance. And this demand for pensions was based or modeled on Civil War pensions that were paid out to disabled veterans, an act that was passed by Congress in 1862. The MRBP filed a lawsuit against the federal government on behalf of the formerly enslaved, claiming monetary reparations. This was a threat to the US government. Callie House was convicted of mail fraud and served time in prison. Nevertheless, her work is instrumental in the reparations movement. From 1950 forward, another amazing and influential woman was at the forefront of the reparations movement, Queen Mother Audley Moore. She was an advocate for reparations and the Committee for Reparations for Descendants of US slaves. In 1957 and 1959, she formally appealed to the United Nations for reparations. This led to the establishment of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent that was established in 2002 by the United Nations, calling for reparations for African Americans in 2016. Queen Mother Audley Moore was a member of the Republic of New Africa, which was established in 1968, which claimed the territory of the southeastern United States as autonomous majority Black nation. The next date we have here is 1969. That marks the issuance of the Black Manifesto by James Forman. This manifesto was issued in May 1969 at the famous Riverside Church in New York City and called for $500 million in reparations from white Americans to be paid by churches and synagogues. Just 500,000 was collected, but that led to the establishment of the Black Economic Research Center, which was a foremost research center up until it closed in 1980. In 1987, we see the establishment of NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. This was founded by the National Conference of Black Lawyers, the New African Peoples Association, and the Republic of New Africa for the sole purpose, and I quote, of obtaining reparations for African descendants in the United States, and has continued to be at the forefront of the movement for reparations. The next date is 1989, and that marks the first filing of HR 40, HR 40 being an act to establish a commission to examine proposals for reparations for African Americans, descendants of slaves. That was filed by Representative John Conyers in 1989, taken over by Sheila Jackson Lee in 2017. 1994, we saw the first of a number of reparations for specific incidents that have taken place over history. Many of these really hushed up. Rosewood, Florida was the site of a major massacre of African Americans in 1923. In 1994, the Florida legislature acknowledged that massacre for the first time and agreed to award 150,000 to each of the victims and a lesser sum to the ancestors. We've since seen moves by other municipalities and institutions to acknowledge atrocities and injustices and to pay reparations. Oklahoma, as we know, has established a commission to study the Greenwood Massacre, which we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of this year. And there are a number of other communities, Evanston, Illinois, Amherst, Massachusetts. So this was the first, really, the Rosewood was really the first in this series. In 1997, there was a class action lawsuit entitled Pigford versus Glickman that was filed on behalf of African American farmers who claimed to have been consistently, persistently underserved by the US Department of Agriculture. Applications for loans were delayed or ignored. Extension services that were commonly provided to white farmers were denied African American farmers. Inputs that are necessary at certain times of year were not provided. That led to the loss of huge amounts of farms, African American owned farms. So that was filed in 1997. Timothy Pigford was a North Carolina farmer who was the lead plaintiff, and Daniel Glickman was the secretary of the USDA at the time. This was settled in 1999 in favor of the plaintiff, but nothing was paid out. This led to a series of other lawsuits in the Pigford series, eventually leading to payouts starting in 2013. However, the payments have been small and spotty. There have been a lot of bureaucratic obstacles to people actually collecting. The next date on our timeline is 2001, which marks the date of the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, and Xenophobia. This took place in Durban, South Africa. It's worth noting that the US and Israel withdrew from the conference over issues of Zionism. In 2009, the US Congress issued a formal apology for slavery. And the last two dates we have here are 2020, which references the presidential campaign, which featured for the first time really robust discussions of reparations. This was something quite new and frankly, long overdue. And finally, we come to the year that we're in right now, 2021. Now, if you recall, HR 20 was filed in 1989. That was 32 years ago. And it is only this year in April that this bill, which has been filed over and over again, was finally sent out to the House Judiciary Committee, where it was reported out favorably. I'm just going to read a bit about HR 40 for those who are not familiar with it. HR 40 is the, quote, Commission to Study Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. It was filed by Representative John Conyers in 1989, as I said. The stated purpose of this bill and its companion bill in the Senate is to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13 American colonies between 1619 and 1865, and to establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery, its subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans, and the impact of these forces on living African Americans, to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies and for other purposes. So while it was filed in 1989, it was not until this year, 2021, 32 years later, that it was sent
Oh,
to committee. So this happened in April, and we're really so fortunate to have Representative Clark, to have you here this evening as a co-sponsor of the bill and someone who's a steadfast supporter of reparations. So we are really excited to hear from you. Um, I think we can let the slides go now so that we can actually see the speaker. So we have 3 questions for you. And I'll begin with the first. As a co-sponsor of HR 40, can you tell us why you believe reparations for African Americans is such a critical issue for our country?
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Siobhan. Chiffon, I'm sorry. I am just so pleased to be here with you. And thank you for walking us through that timeline and for everybody who's joining this critical conversation. And I am so grateful for your work in highlighting this and for everyone who is taking part. Because as I look at where we are in this country right now, in this moment where we are facing such challenges and we are wrestling with racial, economic, and climate justice, and how intertwined all of these challenges are, I feel that reparations is, if we continue to ignore it, if we don't take stock, if we don't review our history and try and make right, then we are doomed to repeat the history. We are doomed to still have those toxic roots of slavery and oppression continue to grow into every institution, every piece of our public life. And it really struck me on the cover of the book is a picture of the National Memorial on Peace and Justice that Brian Stevenson was so instrumental in getting uh, in creating. And I was fortunate enough to go there in 2019 in Montgomery, Alabama, as part of the Civil Rights Trail. And the last time that I got to go to Selma in Alabama with John Lewis. And I don't think you can go into that memorial and come out exactly the same person. It is so heavy. It is so terrifying in its simplicity and its quietness, but what it represents. And it made me think of 2 things when it comes to reparations. One, I'm not sure we can ever fully repair the damage that we have done with slavery, with Jim Crow, with just, the wealth gap that you talked about, with wage disparity, with housing disparities. But we absolutely have to try. And we talk about these ideals that we have as a country of liberty, justice, equality for all. And if we want them to be a reality for all, then that starts with doing this work. It starts with looking unblinkingly at our history and also realizing that even though none of us were there, none of us made the actual decisions around slavery, to have slaves, to not have slaves, all those decisions have cleaved our country. And as a white woman, I continue to this day to gain from slavery. In and on the other side, communities of color African Americans, Black Americans continue to suffer and continue to never try quite be able to catch up. So for all of us, we want the security that some of us have, because we know that that is truly how we make these ideals come to life. And that is what makes all of us actually do better. In the end, this is not about, we can try and equal a balance that I'm not sure we can ever fully equal, but we can set a course for the future that is so radically different. And if we don't do it, I think, you know, the seeds of our own destruction are in there. And this isn't just the destruction of communities of color and people of color. It is about all of us and our shared humanity and seeing the divinity in each and every one of us. So this may be the beginning. I am excited that one of the reparations bills after 32 years has moved out of Judiciary Committee. But I do think this is a time in our history. It really struck me in part of the book. It said at every fork in the road, we've chosen the wrong fork. And so let's not do that at this fork in the road where we have a chance to make transformative change.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Definitely. Another question that we have for you is, from an advocacy perspective, what do you see as the relative benefits of bringing HR 40 to the floor for a full vote versus advocacy for President Biden to take executive action to establish this commission from the White House?
Yeah. Well, part of me says, let's get this done. Let's get this process started in whatever way we can. But I do think there is a power in the vote of the US Congress, because when each of us goes to Congress and representative government, we are standing for people, for 750,000 voices and experiences. And we know the power of having people in Congress that reflect our country. But let's have a vote of Congress that says we see our country, we see its flaws, we see its history, we see its oppression, and we're going to vote to look at that, learn from that, and move together and make the necessary repairs. As I said before, not that we can undo damage of 400 years that is so deep, but that we can start anew with a new compact and the way that we look at rooting out racism in our institutions, in our neighborhoods, in our places of worship, in our jobs, and make sure that we are saying by a vote in Congress that we see this and that our democracy acknowledges that we can have we can, you know, continue to ignore our history, uh, or we can have a democracy. And let's choose that democracy. And let's make sure that is one that truly works for every person. And that we continue in this moment where of fragility for our democracy and that right to vote, all these core principles have been so challenged. Let's move forward together. So that's why, you know, I will take an executive order if that's what it, you know, if we can begin this work. But I think that it would be so much more powerful coming from a vote of Congress.
Thank you. Thank you. So finally, here we are, all of us here this evening, and we'd love to hear from you what you think that we as members of the public can do to support your efforts and efforts for reparations. So particularly HR 40, if there are other ways too, we'd really love to hear from you because we're eager, as you know, to get this moving.
Well, as I was thinking about the answer to this question, I came up with a very long list of to-dos for all of you.
Okay.
But I will try and pare it down because it's a little weighty. But, I think that for each of us, this issues around race, around reparations, around oppression, privilege. None of this is easy. None of it is comfortable. It is something that is hard to have a discussion, and to acknowledge that even if you fervently believe in equality and equality of opportunity, you are part of a larger system that fights against it, and that we have a role and a responsibility there that we were born into. And so this can be difficult. So I want to applaud everybody on this call for being here and for thinking about it and thinking about reparations, which, I think we're not going to get to that place of equality and justice without doing this work of reparations. But for each of you, I think it means also, you are already educating, ourselves on reparations and what it means. But I think as we go into elections, municipal elections in the fall and in the spring, and then we'll have the federal midterms coming up in 22. We need to make sure that we are asking candidates where they are on this, that we are continuing to educate our communities, that we hold more forums like this one, that we suggest in our book clubs that we read this book on reparations, that we have those conversations even when they're not comfortable, even when they bring a feeling of shame, because that's how we move past this into a stronger place. So I think we have to do everything we can to raise this issue publicly in whatever sphere you have your personal influence, whether that's a place of worship or a town hall you attend. Put people on the record, because it's how we start to think about this, and not some sort of scary way that's, makes people feel afraid and ashamed, but as really this is community building. This is how we energize freedom and liberty in our communities and in our country. And I think the other really key thing we have to do is fight with everything we have to protect the right to vote, and make sure that backlash that we're seeing against the 2020 elections, the huge misinformation, cannot take hold again. Because, again, back to this National Memorial for Peace, on so many of these slabs that represent lynchings, it was because people had gone to try and vote. And we can't forget how powerful that right to vote is, that it holds our liberty within it. And that is why it is so often used and suppressed and used as a tool of oppression, because of the power that it has. And we are seeing this again with 48 states proposing voter suppression laws. 48 states. And we've seen what's happened in Georgia and Florida and Texas and Arizona. And we have to, as a public, make our voices heard. The bills that we have proposed that protect voting rights are so tied to this work around reparations. And if we are going to get that vote in Congress, if we are truly going to have a participatory democracy, we have to do everything we can at this moment. It's not tomorrow, it's not next year, it's not the fall, it's now. And I have seen public sentiment change members of Congress and how votes happen. And we have that power. So I guess my other big request would be is know your power and know your voice is the only voice that really can bring change. And we have to do it as a collective, but that starts with each of us in an individual decision that we are going to work for reparations. We are truly going to work for justice, and we are going to protect the power of the vote for everyone so that we can get to those other things and rebuild an economy coming out of this pandemic that is transformative, not returning to the status quo, not accepting that, but truly pushing for an inclusive economy so we can set a future that's worthy of all of our children.
Thank you. It is definitely, I like the emphasis on repairing, and this is something that we're doing for our democracy, for our country. It's for everyone.
It's for everyone, right?
Um, it's often portrayed as something for among white people as something for someone else, but it's for all of us. We have all a major role to play. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Now, I guess we want to give some time for our participants to join the conversation. And there are a cluster of questions that relate to this idea of kind of local action and kind of local reparations. Even in the past week, we've seen, as it relates to Tulsa, this idea of local reparations. There are some special things going on in California, in Evanston. So we're seeing this increasingly across the country. And so there's some general questions regarding this idea of local reparations efforts relative to federal ones. Do you have any perspective on that, Congresswoman Clark?
Well, thank you. I think that's a great question. And I would say to it, all of the above. We need to do it all. One of the things that I was really surprised, and I apologize to any Floridians who might be on this call, was that one of the only truly successful reparation efforts came out of Florida. I did not see that one coming when I started reading this book. But it just goes to show that we can do this anywhere. And I think it is important that not only do we have this federal recognition and that we engage in this in the country, but that we also address it locally in our communities and learn that history, learn what happened in Medford. Don't always assume, as I think so many times we do, that this happened somewhere else. That this was a Southern problem, that this was something that, today, we don't really see the benefits, and therefore somehow we don't have to take the responsibility. We do. And so those local efforts, that recognition, that education, letting Black Americans, our neighbors, our friends, know that we see them, we understand, and we are listening more than we're talking, and want to understand how reparations could be formed locally that would be meaningful to people in our communities.
Thank you, Congresswoman Clark. Sean Osborne in the chat talked about, even in as early as the 1950s, realtors wouldn't often do business with Black buyers in suburban towns all across Middlesex County, and we still see the legacy of that today. We have some questions in the chat related to the idea of specificity. So this idea of, what do you think about speaking for specificity for Black Americans versus sometimes people talk about BIPOC or people of color or Black and brown? Given the unique history of the descendants of slavery in this country, do you believe it's important to be specific when we talk about reparations?
I think it is. I think it is. And I also think that as a white woman, that I need to be listening and taking the lead from those who are affected in those communities and follow their lead on exactly how specific, communities want to be and how they would like to be addressed. I don't think that is a decision for me. I think that is something that I need to be asking the questions and respecting the answers.
We have a question here from Justin who asks, I'm curious, what can local governments and local leaders do to move the needle forward on racial justice and the reparations movement?
Yeah, I think that fits back into what we were just talking about. I think that that can look very different for different communities, but that it is also a chance to continue to educate people about what reparations are. And it could look very different depending on the history of your community and the desire of those affected and oppressed. So I think that is the power of making sure that we are doing this work locally and really looking at our neighbors and listening to them about what would be some of the things that we can do in our communities here in the 5th Congressional District and throughout Massachusetts. Sometimes we like to think of ourselves, well, we're such a liberal state and we're not passing these terrible voting laws. So are we really part of this problem? And the answer is a resounding yes. And I think that those local examples, bringing it home to people about how slavery impacted people, about what was just brought up about redlining of people of color from moving into communities here, and how the wealth gap that you mentioned, Jennifer, that startling $8 figure that the Globe had to reprint and say this was not a mistake because people couldn't really take it in. $8 compared to $250,000, that's very real. And that continues on. And that ability to accumulate wealth and create generational wealth is something that we have to think about and how that has impacted local communities. So I think having these discussions that can start in our towns and our cities or in a neighborhood can really help craft not only what reparations looks like and is meaningful for the communities we live in, but it can also help us build the reparations movement nationally and help us, start to flex that muscle, that this is not something to be afraid of, that looking at this history, that it is time for responsibility and not become paralyzed by shame, and move forward together. And I think we can really help the national movement and the federal movement around this by the work we do on the local level.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Jennifer, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to say, I really think that's so important to build it from the ground up. And I think one example that's very interesting is Amherst, Massachusetts. The first thing they've set out to do is study their history and to really look at it. And I think that every town, every municipality, and as you said, Representative Clark, every neighborhood, if we were to study our history, we would find out if to use that repair analogy again, we'd figure out how things got broken and
Right.
and realize that realize the history and fess up, own it. Really important, I think. And I think Medford's been so interesting because I remember when I first moved here 30 years ago, being in City Hall and noticing a still and in one of the cases, and it said Medford was one of the, if not the best known rum producer in the United States. And I thought,
Yeah.
but the connections weren't made, you know.
Yeah, right. And uh, I've watched, this is just one example, but the Melrose Historical Commission has been doing a series on Instagram highlighting the history of that city, which, is a small suburban city. I don't think a lot of people were like, oh, they must have had a real role in slavery, and the abolition movement, but it's all there. And it's so important to know the positives and the negatives, and figure out what action of reparation would be appropriate and would be welcome and meaningful in helping us heal and move forward.
We have a question from Alan in the chat, and it reads, considering how decisions of US legislators are often driven by what they perceive as popular with their constituents, what messaging do you think would be effective at persuading broad portions of the American electorate that reparations should at least be seriously considered?
Yeah, well, I think it is about security and protecting our democracy. If we all want to live in a secure country with a robust economy, we want to create great jobs, and we want to make sure that we have a future as a democracy. Reparations is a great place to start. And I think that our messaging has to be around looking at our history. And so many people sort of woke up in the last year to like, what can I do? I feel like I'm a bystander to police violence, and how can I make my voice heard? And this is a great way to engage. And I think the more we talk about it, the more local actions that we take, the more that we ask of our campaigns and politicians of where do they stand on this. We can take this with education out of the realm of being something that people are afraid of and ashamed to look at, to something that they see the opportunity for all of us and the connection. And this isn't just important for Black Americans. It is important to make sure that we have communities that are strong going forward. And there's something in this for everyone. And I think we have to continue to underscore that, but that's where the power of this local action really can come home.
Would you be willing to take some time to do a little bit of education in the legislative process? Say we find ourselves in a situation now as post markup for HR 40, it goes to the floor. Let's say we have the votes. What does reconciliation look like with the Senate bill? Can you help people understand some of the strategic considerations and complexity of the legislative process, especially as it relates to a bill such as this at this time?
Yeah, well, it's I will fully confess that I'm very biased for the House in all of these discussions, that I see us as the engine of change, the ones that have passed police reform legislation, the one that is, one of my passions is childcare, not only because unaffordable childcare affects Black families, it's incredibly challenging for Black families, even though it's expensive for every single family, but also because childcare providers are predominantly women of color. And so I look at, and we pay them poverty wages for doing critical work. In fact, our whole economy is built on the low paid or unpaid work of women, and particularly women of color. So we in the House, I think, are addressing this head on with the money we put into childcare, into fixing, into trying to raise the minimum wage, into looking at the Equality Act, immigration reform, addressing gun violence, all these bills that have come to roost in the Senate. And I think that part of the barrier that we have to success, reconciliation is this very complicated process for helping us get some budget items through. But for reparations, I think, I would hope that this would be an issue where we could have broad bipartisan support. I am confident we could get out of the House. But I think part of the process of looking at this, we have to look at what the filibuster has become in the US Senate. The filibuster is a Jim Crow era procedure that was in its current form. This isn't Mr. Smith goes to Washington, hold the floor of the Senate and speak until you change minds. This is from any office, a Senate can torpedo a bill, and it has been used throughout history to be especially effective in blocking civil rights legislation. And so I think that part of our advocacy for reparations also has to be for changing the Senate and making sure that we have that honor our democracy.
Thank you, Congresswoman Clark. Thank you so much. That concludes our question and answer period. We want to thank you, Congresswoman Clark, for just your responsiveness and your readiness to engage, for reading the book, and also hopefully for encouraging your counterparts and colleagues on both sides of the aisle and in both houses to also read the book. You have really set an example that we encourage your colleagues to kind of take notice of and to be guided by. Before we move to conclude, I wanted to give you a couple moments for any concluding remarks you have, Congresswoman Clark.
Well, thank you, Chiffon. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Jennifer, and everybody on this call. This is something we're all in together. And it is this moment that I think, despite the challenges we face, despite the oppression, the fragility of our democracy, we have an opportunity to make this a transformative moment, to say this is when we chose as a people, as a country, to change course and to sever our ties with slavery and bring to life these ideals of equality and justice. And the work is not going to be easy. It is painful to look at this, to look at the terror, the oppression, the lives that were lost, and the very real gains that were made by white Americans that we continue to benefit from today. But if we do this work, we can really change the course of our country, and we can be an example to the world of that ordinary people can make huge changes and really bring a country back to life that has never lived up to the promise that it has in its founding documents. So this is the time. And I am so grateful to you in particular and to everyone on this call for being part of this and for being part of the reparations movement.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for joining our conversation today. We want to encourage you to please stay connected with us. We also want to encourage you to heed the practical recommendations we heard today from Congresswoman Clark for us to understand our power, for us to get people on record, to understand their position on reparations as key to the security and safety of our entire nation, something that we all benefit from. So we ask you to contact your area state congressional members and to tell them to advance reparations. If they're in Congress, they have received a book from us. Ask them, have they been reading the book? Also, if you would be interested in having a similar conversation with one of your elected legislative officials, please let us know. We would welcome the opportunity to partner with you to do that. We welcome the opportunity to advance the work of reparations in any way. If you look in the chat, you'll see our Twitter page, our branch webpage, and also some email and phone information if you'd like to follow up further. We thank you so much for joining us today, and take care.
I have a question.
Oh, you have a question. Well, we're kind of concluding, but we technically have 3 minutes left.
Okay.
Let's go for it. We're
I
having
would
a
like to
conversation.
know.
Let's go ad hoc a
Okay.
little bit. I hope it's great, Cecilia.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I would like to know how reparations involve large corporations who participate, large American corporation who participated in leasing system in the 1880s, where men and women were arrested and rented to large corporations to do work. And many individuals are still searching for these lost family members. I just want to know, how does reparation address large corporations?
Have you had the chance to read the book, Cecilia, that we are discussing today?
Not yet.
I would encourage you to read it. It does talk about everything from large corporations, including banks, insurance companies, the garment industry, tobacco. The reality is the economic engine of this country is tied to chattel slavery and the subsequent exclusion of the full humanity and citizenship of the descendants of slavery. And so that is considered as part of it. If you read the last chapter of the book, it begins to talk about how you might calculate what would be an equitable relief as much as you can quantify it, and what might be some key economic variables under consideration. And it does take those things under consideration. So I strongly encourage you to get the book. Ideally go to UNC Press, because UNC Press has been a key partner to us in this work, and to learn more. And with that question, we are at time now, and we will conclude.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care and stay in touch.
Both of you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Siobhan.